endure the media and the National Guard, assuming they're in a riot at any moment, even though the cops who did the killing were arrested and charged. And even though it's the police who tend to break up black vigils with tear gas and batons, not the other way around. Subjects face disapproving questions about what they did to cause their own death. Subjects fear for their children every day of their lives, even when by the grace of God they make it to adulthood, because they understand that at any day or time, they could meet up with the wrong cop on the wrong day and become the next hashtag. White Americans, unless you are poor or disabled, enjoy the full benefits of citizenship. You can generally vote without impediment, as long as you're not a woke student who prefers the convenience of a drop box. Your family has never faced violent reprisals for trying to go to school or to work. You can live wherever you want without fear of reprisal, rejection, redlining, artificially reduced property values, or your neighbors calling 911 because they don't believe you live there. Historically, America's citizens have felt free to lynch, to riot numerous times from Reconstruction through the 1930s, all the way up to January 6, 2021. They have felt entitled to overthrow the government when they don't like the outcome of an election. As a citizen, the police generally serve and protect you, your property, and your social comfort. Citizens feel free to scream at the police when they're pulled over, or even to swing their fists at them. They get fed by the police after they gun down a church full of worshipers. They calmly surrender after committing a massacre. But those in this country who are still treated as subjects, black folks, regardless of wealth or status, brown folks, AAPI Americans, poor white folks, non-white immigrants, and others who live at the margins of citizenship, live with the constant risk of housing and job discrimination based on your race, your social status, your hairstyle, or your last name. Higher interest rates and inadequate services in the zip codes you somehow always seem to get routed to. You might face discrimination at the airport and extra surveillance based on the outward manifestation of your religion. And then there is the often rude, dismissive, cruel, and too often brutal and sometimes deadly policing, which again was designed to control you and keep you socially confined to a status of inferiority and fear, regardless of how fervently you comply, how high you raise your hands, or how much you scream or beg or cry out for your mom. And it literally doesn't matter whether the police officer is white or looks like you, grew up like you, or could, without that uniform on, be you. It's not the race of the officer, it's the design of the system. Again, occasionally, some of the slave catchers were black. Those are the two Americas. And now you understand why the right doesn't want your kids to know this country's actual history, or for you to know it, because they fear that if you knew, you might want to do something about it. In fact, you might even demand it.
It's horrifying. 13 correctional officers and a nurse implicated in the incident are facing termination. What the hell do you mean termination? Why aren't they arrested now? It's on video. You know who it is. You've articulated it's 13 of them and a nurse. At the very least, where's the arrest of the officers we saw choking him, lifting him up by the neck, kicking him, hitting him with the shoe, punching him in his midsection and beyond, kicking him in the groin? Where are the arrests? Excuse my language. The fuck do you mean termination? Where's the arrest?
Continuing coverage now of the death investigation into Greece native and former inmate Robert Brooks. In court paperwork referencing the autopsy of Brooks, which is not yet available in its entirety, there are details about his multiple injuries from an attack by more than a dozen Marcy Correctional Facility correction officers and staff. Isabel Garcia breaks down what that paperwork tells us.
Yes, the paperwork is called an emergency risk protection order, which was filed by New York State Police against one of the corrections officers accused in Robert Brooks's assault. The details of the autopsy were used as supporting evidence in the application. This due to concern the individual, in this case David Kingsley, may harm himself or another. He was allegedly part of a group of a total of 14 individuals engaged in an assault on Robert Brooks on December 9th at the infirmary at Marcy Correctional. Brooks died at a Utica hospital the next day. In the protection application, it is noted the autopsy of Brooks was conducted at the Onondaga Medical Examiner's office on December 11th. It was determined Brooks suffered multiple bruises on his face and arms and legs, a fractured nasal bone, multiple soft tissue bleeding in his neck on both the left and right sides, as well as bleeding in the genitalia area. Now, the medical examiner also reported concerns for asphyxia, this due to compression of the neck, as well as Brooks's death due to actions of another. It also makes note the final cause and manner of death are still pending at this time. Now, once again, this information was part of an application for extreme risk protection for one of the corrections officers, David Kingsley, named to be involved in the assault. Meantime, family of Robert Brooks held a vigil last night in Rochester with his surviving son, Robert Brooks Jr., saying the family is hopeful his death was not in vain and will be a, quote, catalyst for change, end quote. For now, reporting in the studio, Isabel Garcia, News 8.
Colin Kaepernick took a subtle approach in 2016 to tell us that Black Lives Matter. It went unnoticed for 2 weeks. Colin decided to kneel rather than stand in solidarity with his teammates during the national anthem recital at pro football games. He hoped his silence would be loud enough so people across America would hear his message. Once he had our attention, he was telling us that Black and brown people in the U.S. were being mistreated, abused, and unalived by the hands of the very people who are paid to protect us, the police, law enforcement. At first, Colin was met with criticism and even ridicule by famous and high-ranking Americans, including the U.S. president at that time. They said Colin was un-American, that he was a race baiter and just some privileged biracial Black man who was starting trouble. But Colin didn't let that deter him, even though his own race of Black people were speaking out against his chosen form of protest. Still, Colin continued to push the message. So let's fast forward to 2020. That's when we witnessed a Black man named George Floyd being unalived by a white police officer while Black men, women, and children looked on helplessly. The Black Lives Matter organization was formed in 2013 after Trayvon Martin, you remember Trayvon, a young Black teen who was unalived by a racist white toy cop, George Zimmerman. All because Trayvon wore a hoodie and therefore looked suspicious. And still we witnessed in 4K the unaliving of George Floyd and Robert Brooks after BLM was organized. The Black Lives Matter movement never suggested that white lives, or as they like to say, all lives, matter. The message was then and remains today that America has always had a preconceived notion that white lives matter. But we're here to let you know that Black lives matter too. Our lives matter also. I'm talking regardless of the alleged crimes committed by Black people in this country. Their capture, imprisonment, and treatment should not be more severe than their white counterparts, and it should never lead to abuse or unaliving by the police. Why was that message so hard to understand? And why is the notion that Black people's lives are just as precious as non-Blacks not easy to comprehend? That whole, I was in fear for my life excuse used by the police? It's ludicrous when the Black man they're in fear of is handcuffed behind his back. Just days before the new year 2025, we have yet another example of police brutality and violent abuse, which sadly led to the unaliving of yet another Black man. And that Black man that I'm speaking of is Robert Brooks. Mr. Brooks is now another hashtag. And Black people want us to say his name. Hashtag Robert Brooks. But what's next? We saw video footage released from the police officer's body camera, but it conveniently has no sound, as it was in some kind of standby mode. Yeah, right. As if watching the footage isn't horrific enough without the sound, just looking at the smiling faces of the white police officers as they pummeled this man within an inch of his life. And they continued until there was no life left in his body. No different than what we saw in the case of George Floyd and nameless other Black people whose lives were reduced to a hashtag. After being apprehended and unalived by law enforcement, the attention was redirected to the lifestyle and criminal history of the victim. In this case, with Robert Brooks. He was already in prison. He was in an infirmary within the prison. Robert Brooks had already served 8 years behind bars on a DV conviction where he used a knife to inflict harm on his girlfriend. And thankfully, she survived. That horrible incident happened in 2016, and I know no one's suggesting that that had anything to do with the beating death of Robert Brooks in December of 2024. It's only mentioned so people feel less sympathy for Mr. Brooks. He's lost his life, and now he's being dehumanized as if his life never mattered. Unaliving someone is never justified, in my opinion. But where was this outrage when young white men took the innocent lives of children at elementary schools across this country? It's happened a countless number of times when we've seen the perpetrators handled with kid gloves. It's happened so much that people seem to start becoming desensitized by the news. Robert Brooks was punished for his crime with a sentence of 12 years imprisonment. Now, we all know that according to the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, that Robert Brooks was a slave. He was the property of the U.S. government. In the current form of legal slavery in this country, are we to believe and accept that this type of treatment is permissible? It's given Black lives really don't matter. And when y'all finish marching and burning candles at the prayer vigils, Black lives still won't matter. And the police officers who get charged and found guilty and handed down a life sentence still won't deter future generations of police from creating more victims to add to this list of viral hashtags that keep growing and growing and growing. Joy Reid said it best. It's not the race of the officer. It's the design of the system. Think about it. If my house has a leaky roof, and as a solution, I use a bucket to catch the rain, well, that might temporarily fix the problem. But if another leaks break through in a different part of the roof, should I go get another bucket? I don't know, maybe a bigger bucket this time? That's not sounding like a good solution, right? Okay, well, what if I then hire a handyman to patch up that leak from inside the house? I'm talking mud, tape, and perhaps a new patch of drywall. What's going to happen to that leaky roof? It's still going to leak, right? Because the source of the problem has not been addressed. It's a temporary solution, just as temporary as the buckets on the floor. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that the roof has to be replaced. After all, we can't control the rain, right? That's the real source. But it's unattainable. So what am I trying to say? That until there is systemic change in police reform and constitutional laws that protect the kind of dehumanizing crimes we just witnessed against Robert Brooks, we can expect more of the same. And the only difference will be the date. There has been some change, like the requirement of wearing police body cams. But wait a minute, wasn't the violence against Robert Brooks captured on body cams? Didn't we see the violence against George Floyd on body cam? Of course it was. We all saw it. But that quote unquote solution is tantamount to putting a band-aid over a bullet wound. Do we really even need police officers randomly running license plates or pulling over vehicles for a traffic stop? Aren't there red light cameras and speeding cameras in place for that? A lot of police crimes have resulted after a traffic stop or a 911 call. Sometimes the 911 call is a plea for help because our loved one is reacting recklessly to substance abuse or having a manic episode. Sometimes they don't get the medical attention they need because the cop who feared for his or her life, they drew a pew-pew and it resulted in a loss of life. There's a lot more work to be done, y'all. And it has to be the type of change, I'm talking systemic change, that gets to the root of the problem before a resolution can ever be realized. Black lives have always mattered, and I'm here to tell you that Black lives still matter today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.